think it says in here this is the oldest Italian parish in the country, possibly?
Arguably, yeah. These old churches, I mean, they gave it their all, and when you consider that these are poor people who did this, and then somehow when we get prosperous, we can't do it anymore.
Welcome to the Rich Dawn, where eternal beatitude begins in this life. I'm Kyle Dean, and today I have with me Martin Ederer, a doctorate in history, a professor of history at Buffalo State University, and a practicing Catholic. Martin, how are you today?
Good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And today what we're going to promote is this incredible book. It's called An Italian Immigrant Community and the Scalabrinian Fathers, St. Anthony of Padua Church in Buffalo, New York. Now, my understanding is, you've done many years of dedicated research on probably one of the most fascinating parishes in the history of our region, and I can't wait to get into it with you. So before we do that, though, let's learn a little bit about Martin the man. What drew you to become a historian?
Well, I think I was going to be a shop teacher when I went to college. I did one semester at Christendom College, and the finances didn't work out for that, so I ended up at Buffalo State, where my father taught at the time. And so I was going to be a shop teacher, so I had kind of a crafty background, and got into the major and hated it. In the meantime, I was taking some history classes, and I loved them. So I guess the rest at that point is history. So,
Indeed.
And I just kind of followed it from there and got a degree in history. And then, well, what do you do with a degree in history? Take more history, and so it went. So. Then from there, ended up with a degree in Renaissance Reformation history, which is my formal specialty. Although at Buffalo State, I teach a lot more courses than that. A lot of European history, primarily the early stuff. But once in a while, I make forays into the more modern era.
Wow. Yeah. So I'm learning something in real time. We've obviously been friends in the church community for some years now, but Renaissance Reformation, now would that be like 1200s or?
Generally starts up in the 1300s, and the little known secret, which is why it's bad that we don't learn dates as much as we should. What we call the late Middle Ages up north is the beginnings of the Renaissance in Italy. Both start up at about 1300. So that already tells you that stuff's starting to cook in Europe at that time. Different cultural worlds are emerging, who are developing pretty big misunderstandings of each other. Whether by design or whether just because. And, so that's kind of the nice lead into the Protestant Reformation. So,
no kidding. Yeah.
The Renaissance reaches Rome, and up north they're clinging to God because of all of the awful things that are happening for everybody. But the Italians, they respond in a much more realistic way. It's like, life stinks. That presents unique opportunities, buy low. and up north, it's like things shouldn't be this way, and they're clinging to God. And when they look for their answers with the papacy and with the church, why are they having a party when the world is going down?
Indeed.
So it's kind of fun to tie all of that stuff together.
No, have you ever seen the movie The Mission?
No.
Okay. You reminded me of that.
I don't get out much.
It follows the Jesuits, and it's kind of a tale about, how on the ground they're reforming their local communities, but then off in some ivory tower you've got a red-capped cardinal who is making business decisions that's causing people to literally die. And it reminded me of how you just kind of contextualize that unfortunately, sometimes in the church and out of the church, you run into these scenarios. You know what I mean?
And as far as that goes, Ignatius Loyola and Martin Luther have some pretty strong parallels going on. They're both very intensely worried about their salvation. Both have their life-changing experiences in 1521. That's when Ignatius takes a cannonball to the leg, and that's when Luther gets excommunicated. So obviously they opt for very different solutions, but they have those same fundamental struggles. How can I be saved? And Ignatius puts it finally in the hands of God, as Luther does, but Luther gives up on works in the process. So it really turns on nuances. We tend to make these all big dramatic things and all of these sectarian controversies that follow, but it's really nuances. It's like one compass point difference that ends up making all the difference when you end up down the road a couple of thousand miles,
Absolutely. And that's why I kind of honed in on asking about the 1200s when I heard Renaissance Reformation, because, as a Catholic, classically trained, I don't immediately assume Protestant Reformation when I hear that term. Like I'm thinking about, I'm partial. You mentioned I mentioned the Jesuits bringing up that movie, but the Franciscans is what I most resonate with. St. Francis of Assisi is my patron. He and I have a lot in common. And I love that he's kind of considered one of the great first reformers. Not first. I mean, Reformations happened throughout all of church history. You think of St. Peter Damian in his day with all of the corruption going on.
Let's talk about dates there too.
Sure.
The honest way to identify the Reformation era is just to call it the Reformation, full stop, end of sentence. Because the way it ends up working out is there are people saying in the Catholic Church, we need to reform this mess. We need to reform this mess. In fact, they're the ones who are handing out the ammunition to everybody because they know there's a problem. But they're kind of addicted to a lifestyle. They're kind of addicted to where they're at with things. So the Catholics, we need to reform, and there are all kinds of reformers that stay in the church to do that. However, There are others who say, this is hopeless, we quit. Isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I've run into people, like we've had some, our fair share of scandals in our lifetime, locally and globally, right? Mm-hmm. It's more challenging when it's locally because it hits close to home, and then you get people that they don't even come to church anymore. They reference Ezekiel 34 and elsewhere to kind of say that, this is why I don't even need to go to mass. And then pastorally, you really have to come in with solutions. And, that kind of brings it to my whole point. I've heard Catholics describe the Reformation era as really the Protestant Revolution. It's not really a Reformation.
You can make that case.
These are, no question. Yeah. And these are working definitions. It's kind of like how people bring up the Crusades and they just have this glossy bird's eye view that Christians are terrible people because they killed other people. And it's like, there's way more nuance to it than that.
Of course.
And
like North Africa at one time was very Christian. Yeah.
Right.
The Middle East at one time was quite Christian.
Right.
So it makes it, the way I explain it to my students a lot of times is, look, people usually don't do things because I want to be the biggest jerk I can possibly be. Most people don't get out of bed in the morning saying that to themselves.
Right.
They do things for reasons, and as historians, we need to figure out what those reasons are. Suspend judgment until you've done the homework on it. Curious first, furious later. A lot of times people lead with the furious because it's empowering, and ideology is kind of you want to talk the real.
It's one hell of a drug. Let's be honest.
Yeah, the real opiate of the masses because it makes you feel empowered and you get the sound off, and I understand all of that. Sometimes you just got to blow off steam, but the problem is oftentimes truth somewhere gets lost in all the wreckage that follows.
Right.
The truth tends to make us all uncomfortable.
Well, that's
at some point.
That's the true philosopher's quest, right? Follow the truth wherever it leads, regardless of the personal cost.
Yeah, and sometimes it stinks. It's like
many times
you want the story to go this way, but then you look at the evidence, and in that respect, we talk about following the science. Well, sometimes if everyone really followed the science in any field, they should be humbled enough at some point to say, well, this is what we know right now.
And dare I say, carry your cross daily. That doesn't exactly sound like it's all roses and whistling Dixie. So, this is a great segue into the next question I wanted to ask you, Martin. You've mentioned this is, how I relate to my students, and you are the master, the doctor of a craft that is it, by the way,
please.
Is it a doctor of arts or sciences?
The bachelor's degree is Bachelor of Arts.
Okay. So the art form of it, interesting. I mean, they obviously interplay.
Well, there are facts in history. I always have this argument with a few students. Does truth exist? Well, I don't think so. Well, is that true?
Sure.
That standard line. Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's like, look, there are facts in history. Now, when you have to start explaining, right? In some respects, we're like journalists, right? Who, what, when, where, why, how.
Absolutely.
Right? And this is what happened. These are facts. Yeah, well, what if you use a different dating? Yeah, well, it still happened. Whatever dating system you use, right?
Wow.
Facts happen. They're for real. Now, when you have to start explaining why, how, to what extent, then you have to try to reason through them. And that's where interpretation becomes a big part of doing history. Now, you can do something, hopefully you follow something that's plausible. And you do that knowing full well that there may be someone after you who decides that, no, this doesn't work. Maybe more evidence is brought to bear. I think you're aware of government documents. At some point, stuff gets declassified that had been classified for a long time, and we learn more, and that may change our interpretations of things. And in that respect, it's very much like doing science, because we learn more as we go. And some of my colleagues, I always mention to them, well, at one time, didn't science say certain things about races that now we don't buy anymore?
Adhere to, right?
Yeah. So science, because people still do science. And where there's people, there's politics. And where there's politics, there's fill in the blank.
All kinds of good stuff. And another heck of a drug, right? So, well, it's funny. You almost like telepathically answered my question before I asked it, which is like, what is the art or what is the science of it? You made the case how it's an art form, but it taps into the sciences. Obviously, we know, science is just, in Latin, is scientia, which just means knowledge.
No.
So you're pouring over the datum points of the knowledge, but there is an artistry to this, and that's kind of my overarching question. Like, objectively speaking, how do you mentioned how you have to take the data, the who, what, where, when, why, how, but then there comes a point where interpretation, by necessity, needs to come into the process. How do you maintain?
What does it mean, right? What does it mean? And oftentimes I get students now that give me the data dump because it's all right there somewhere on the internet. There's all kinds of stuff. It's not like the old days when you had to go to the library.
No kidding.
And they give me all of this data and hope that something will stick. And I always ask them, I have to thank one of my professors in grad school for this. So what? Why does this matter? Where are you going with this?
Right. Well, how does that factor into interpretation? Where does that come in while balancing it with objectivity?
Well, you should never do violence to your basic sources. And hopefully they will guide how you interpret things. You develop a sense at some point. You work with enough of this evidence, and to a certain extent, you're a bit of a psychologist, a bit of a philosopher. All of that comes to play. You're dealing with humanity in all of its technicolor greatness and all of its technicolor yuck. And you need to kind of make all of that make some sort of sense. And it's always a balancing act. And I know I don't always get it right. I don't think any historian does if they're being honest.
Well, that's part of humility as well, right?
Well, that's important. And a lot of intellectuals, they struggle with that, not being able to know everything. And there's a lot of real estate between knowing everything and knowing nothing. And most of us live somewhere between those two extremes, because otherwise we're nowhere, right?
That's the human experience.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a lesson I learned young when I learned about how in the field of science, you'll have people, archaeologists, let's say, that they spend decades trying to find that one thing. It could be in the pyramids, it could be wherever the dig is, and they all of a sudden resources come in the form of financial kickbacks or whatever, and they will spend their entire career trying to square a circle if that's unfortunately the route they take, where they're like, listen, I need to prove this in order to make good on my donors or whatever.
Sells books.
And their entire career gets staked on it. And that's a scary lesson. It's that people could spend their entire lives obfuscating the truth within themselves in order to pursue a passion or whatever the reasoning of it might be.
Yeah. That
they can't accept that they might be wrong and that's okay.
Well, they follow an initial hunch, and that's okay if you want to pursue it. But at some point, maybe you just have to say uncle and move on, and that's hard for most of us because we need to have meaning in life. We need to know that we're worth something, and professionals especially, as I think you're well aware, professionals, that's very important to them. Like the old thing they say years ago, well, if a politician cheats on his wife, you'd probably cheat on all of us. As a historian, I've always taken kind of a dim view of that kind of reasoning because I think a lot of careerists are much more likely to cheat on their spouses than they are to do something bad to their career.
Why do you think that is?
It's more important.
Cut off the nose despite the face?
It's more important.
Well, that's sad.
It's the priority. Yeah.
Well, it's a sad but true, perhaps, fact of life then, that you need to be able to gauge. It's interesting how there's an interplay, right? Because obviously I'm a training for theology, my master's here. We're almost done, and part of that is moral theology, and there's a big kind of a connection, a bridge built between the art of being a historian and moral theology, because we also need to put on the journalist hat.
Human acts.
Right, with the who, what, where, when,
Yeah.
why, how, and it's like the who correlates to, or excuse me, well, the who is just who's doing something, but the what correlates to the objective reality of it.
Yeah.
The where, when, how corresponds to the circumstances, but then the why is the motive. And of course, we know in Catholic theology and also just philosophy, that moral philosophy, that the what is what's objective, the circumstances and the motive are what's subjective. And you need all of it. You need the totality of it in order to understand that technicolor vision. But you also need to proportion it within, where those things reside. I mean, there is objectivity has a superiority in many ways to the subjective reality of it.
And you have to have that bedrock to work with. But then there's all of the mud on top.
Well, I think that's where, this is where the Thomism in me comes in. That's where, like, your emotions or your imagination or your cogitative power, all these things reside in your body. Yeah. And if you allow them to have pride of place in your overall comportment, then you got a serious problem.
Yeah.
As opposed to allowing your intellect to be your king and your will to be your queen, and all the other lower faculties to be subjected to your interior garden that makes up your soul-body composite.
It's all about getting a balance, isn't it? It's about moderation. It's about, and humans are so good at that.
Well, so let's put some skin on this concept. We've given a bird's eye view of, what it is to be a historian and to be a trained expert in that. And it's a distinct lens from whatever other profession, right? Obviously the datum points that you're focusing on are things that have happened throughout time and space. There's a lot of it. There is kind of a continuum to that, and I think it's really fascinating because if we focus on our subject today, which is this book that you have written on the history of one of the oldest, I think it says in here that this is the oldest Italian parish in the country, possibly?
Arguably, yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's amazing. And obviously it comes with highs and lows and the good, the bad, and the ugly, like any great story does throughout history. And one of the coolest things about this is while it dates back to the 1800s where, our ancestors are dead and buried, it also corresponds into the present, which is still living to this day. And
why are we as messed up as we are? That's a good reason for doing history. How did we end up here?
Well, they always say, history repeats itself, and the whole idea is try to break that cycle. It doesn't seem to ever happen.
Well, because history never repeats itself perfectly. Circumstances are always different. There are so many variables. A colleague of mine years ago said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yes.
This is probably a more accurate way to look at that. But yeah, obviously, we see these patterns that repeat, and hopefully we can learn something so we don't repeat as much of it as maybe we shouldn't.
Absolutely.
And
And I'll bring one more lens into this from a theological perspective. There are at times, obviously, there's the spiritual realm. And so you've got the good, the bad, and the ugly there as well in terms of generational influences and other things that can creep into the life of any story throughout history. And so there's lessons to be learned from a Catholic perspective as well. Obviously, you mentioned, you're a practicing Catholic, so there's...
Someday I might actually get it right.
Yeah.
Probably not today, though.
Hopefully, let me know when you figure that out, please, for my sake as well.
I don't think I'll be alive for that anymore.
Well, who knows?
You won't be either.
Well, yeah, God willing, you know what I mean? Life is a conversion journey until the end. But so to put some skin on it and to get into the history of St. Anthony's, you do a really methodical, analytical job of breaking down the life of this specific parish.
Yeah, that's the German in me.
Gotcha. And all right. So you're German and Bavarian, right? Okay.
Bavarian Austrian mix. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and
definitely we're Southern.
Okay. And I'm
the
actually
Catholics, the Baroque, the fun parts where everybody else wants to travel to because let's face it, Baroque is fun. Alps are fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm part Italian. So this really speaks to my heart. I've heard that we have near certainty in our family that when we emigrated to this country, St. Anthony's was, our hub for coming into this country, as it was for so many. And then, but I'm also, that's a quarter of me. I'm a quarter German, Irish, and Italian. So you mentioned throughout this book, especially in the foreword and the introduction to it, that largely comprises of Catholic historical Buffalo of old.
Yeah.
So in a very proportionate way, I kind of, I'm thankful that somehow World War II has resolved itself within me. So in any event,
it's receded enough that at least some of us can have some fun with it.
100%, 100%. So it starts in 1890.
Yeah, the story starts in 1890. The parish itself was established the following year, so 1891.
And it goes until this book came out, in 2011, I think. Or 2010?
Yeah, you tell me. What does it say? It's somewhere around there.
It's got to be in here.
2011, yeah.
December 2011, finished printing.
Yeah.
So there we go.
But it took about 5 years to actually get it together. So
really,
yeah,
it's actually not too bad.
The ironic thing with when we do history is by the time we're done with a work like this, it's already no longer current because you don't have the time to read all the most current stuff. But
it kind of takes the pressure off, doesn't it?
Well, history ain't rocket science either. I mean, if it comes out this year or next year, it isn't going to change that much. Yeah. So anyway, that's the dirty little secret of historians, but
absolutely,
and not a whole lot of people are writing parish histories, and certainly not to this extent. I think the only other parish that can claim that in Buffalo is St. Louis, which actually has a bumpier ride than St. Anthony's.
Now that's the first church in Buffalo, right?
First Catholic church in Buffalo, and it was started for everybody in 1827. But very quickly, German became the dominant demographic, so there went the neighborhood. And then things started to rock and roll from there. They have a historian over at St. Louis who can tell you all of these great stories. They were placed under interdict twice.
I've been given a tour.
Yeah, and then you probably dealt with him, Michael Reister. And they were placed under interdict twice, and a lot of it had to do with ethnicity issues.
Really?
Originally, they were subject to Bishop Hughes in New York. And he wanted them to sign over the deed to the parish to the Diocese of New York, which they refused to do because they had paid for the property itself. They incorporated themselves, largely because there was no other way to have a church. And then when this Irish bishop comes and says, hand me the deed, the Germans balk. It's like, wait a minute. And so he places them under interdict. Wow. And then later when Bishop Timon comes and sets up the Diocese of Buffalo, the same request. Again, they balk. Placed under interdict, so he brings in the Jesuits to break them, which is the beginnings of St. Michael's Church, just across town. And they were actually
been Jesuit until just this past year.
Yeah, they were originally stationed actually out in Williamsville, which was a John Neumann parish originally. So then they were brought into Buffalo to break St. Louis. And things just kind of did a slow burn from there. And eventually, Timon died, and the new bishop said, I don't understand what the big problem is. So they maintained ownership until I think it was like 1978 or 1979. So
wow.
So yeah, they kind of, and it's kind of ironic, now that increasingly they want parishes to take over more of their own affairs and decentralizing things. And some of the people at St. Louis would tell you, well, we always had lay leadership here.
Right. Well, maybe one was in the wake of Vatican I and the other was in the wake of Vatican II.
But notice how much of it is about ethnicity. And part of it was, Irish bishops' blind spots too, because they expressed their Catholicity in some very Irish ways. And so their Catholicity had a strong Irish accent, and a lot of other ethnic Catholics in the area, they felt that.
What would an Irish Catholicity mean from leadership perspective?
Well, get rid of all of those nice square singable hymns that the Germans sing because they sound too Lutheran. Uh-huh. And there was always that sense they felt that they were second-class citizens, in part because the Irish, they had the English, so they ended up in charge. That's why you ended up with Irish cops too. They knew English, and these other ethnic groups had to learn English first. So the Germans went through that. The Polish went through that, and the whole Polish national Catholic movement. And the Italians, it played out mainly administratively. A lot of the Italians is like, look, they had a long history with the church, and we ignore them, they ignore us, and somehow we work it out.
Right.
So again, much more realists about these things. It just is what it is.
Absolutely. And I remember
grumble about the priests if you must, but it's not worth burning any churches down over.
Absolutely. I remember growing up, under all these ethnicities that, it was instilled in me that once upon a time you kind of stayed within your quadrant of Catholicism. You had the Germans on the east side, the south towns, you had the Irish, and were the Italians in the north towns, or was that more recent?
Oh, that's recent. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Italian, the big Italian community was down by the Hooks, lower west side, of course. Then they extended farther up. Yeah. And St. Anthony's was the first church, and then there were a few others that followed. Our Lady of Mount Carmel in 1906, down in the Hooks, and there was All Souls in close in South Buffalo. There was St. Lucy over not too far from where St. Columba Bridget is today.
It's been closed, right?
Long gone, yeah. Urban renewal took care of that in 1960 already.
Yeah, I like how they brought that one back. The renewal.
Yeah.
That's great.
Renewal. And then Holy Cross, and there was a big controversy between St. Anthony's and Holy Cross. So, even among these parishes. And a lot of it had to do with the Scalabrinians versus the Diocese of Buffalo, and differing visions for what to do with these ethnic groups. Sure. And of course, the Italians, a lot of bishops all over the country were wringing their hands about the Italians because they just weren't supporting churches like the Irish were. Because for the Irish, the church stood between them and an oppressive government, the British, right? For the Germans, ethnically or religiously divided land even before Germany was unified, and so the church would stand up for Catholic people. The Polish, you don't need me to tell you that whole story, right? The church, helps to keep their nation together in the absence of a real nation. But for the Italians, oftentimes, the church is actually the local government. Now, it would be like, now we're asking you to donate money to the IRS. So I think you can understand why Italians are like, no. It didn't help either that the Italians were much more desperately poor in many instances than some of the other immigrants. A lot of the Germans came over as farmers. They had skills. They may have had more education coming over. With the Poles, a lot of them were getting educated by Germans or Austrians. I mean, the Russian Poles weren't doing too well, but for a lot of the Italians, and it wasn't really an oppressive government. It was just they lacked the economy to make this kind of stuff happen. So there it is in a nutshell. I mean, it's obviously a lot of dynamics taking shape and all of that, but
so
that's kind of the quick and dirty.
You didn't do great in the trade school, so you entered the trade of human existence.
Yeah. The other thing with the Italians a lot of times is Americans had certain ideas about who they were and what they were capable of doing. Oh, they're better working outside. So there were certain jobs closed to them, as certain ethnicities came to dominate certain jobs. And the Italians, construction. How does that story go? They're told that the streets in America are paved with gold, and the Italians got here and realized that, number one, the streets aren't paved at all, and number two, they're expected to pave them. So there were certain jobs that already certain ethnicities dominated, and they weren't about to let other people in. And so since the Italians were one of the later groups to come, they were pretty much stuck with what was left. So a lot of them ended up, going into business or, being greengrocers or get into construction because that's outside work, and those were the attitudes. And
and in St. Anthony's, when this came into being, I mean, basically when you came over as an immigrant, you don't even speak the native tongue, you don't speak the English. You really relied on that priest to help you with your status as a citizen, with emigrating, with I mean, that's what I heard, that it's like the lightning rod for even being able to kind of get in. And of course a trust is naturally built that way. And you're connected to your community as a result.
Although sometimes the men tended to be very anti-clerical among the Italian community, and it's like, the women go and spend all our money on the priest. There was that kind of attitude too among some of them.
Kind of like they're outside smoking cigarettes while the women are inside praying.
Yeah. Plus, there were other problems. The Protestants were starting to get into the act in the hopes that they could make good Americans out of Italians, because the jury was still out on Italians. They're kind of almost black. And in those times, that stuff, people took that stuff very seriously.
Well, you don't have to sell it to me. I'm sure a modern or a modernist, especially listener, if for whatever reason they were on this channel, would be like balking at this or just totally flabbergasted at your level of wisdom and obviously experiential. You've done the research on this, because nowadays I think we paint with such broad strokes today. And if you want to bring ethnicity into a conversation about the state of America, but as I'm going to tap into the Polish that's in me now. I mean, because you're speaking all of my languages right now, which is a real treat, by the way. Thank you so much. But obviously it's not lost on me as a Pole that, as a Slavic person, the etymology of being of a Slavic origin comes from being a slave. And a lot of people have these, really, how to say, shallow, short distance view of the history of some of these realities. And they go back quite a long while. And the way it's basically what you're describing in a word is survival.
Yeah, and it's okay if we project back on a certain level and say, look, we can objectively say that some of these mentalities or some of these practices, we now know they're wrong.
Right.
But at the same time,
maybe make right somehow.
You also need to understand these events in their own context first, and say, look, this was. I was having this discussion with my wife, I guess just earlier today. It's like, where people say, oh, well, as a child I was brutalized by my parents and by the nuns at the Catholic school.
Sure.
And it's like
rulers on the knuckles.
And back in the day, that was just a day in the life. Now, if we want to objectively say now, that wasn't good pedagogy. God bless you, say it.
Right.
But you need to also understand that this is how it was done at this time. And while it looks so awful to us now, it may not, you hate to be a moral relativist on this stuff, but it might not have been that awful to the people back then.
Well, people used to have a thicker skin. There's absolutely no question about that. And then also that's why we get the adage to snowflakes today in the culture and whatever, but also...
Or conversion by the sword. I use this example sometimes in my classes. We think of that as an awful thing, and I think everyone now agrees. Forcing someone to a religion is not what religion should be about. Whether
absolutely.
And from the secular perspective, there's agreement. This is an awful thing to do. But if you consider at the time a lot of that is happening, what happens typically at that time? Let's go back to the 700s. What happens if you lose a war? You become a slave, right? And that's the best case scenario. You become a slave. Now, what if someone comes and says, believe in Jesus or else? Well, what do I have to do? Well, just let me pour some water over your head, and then you believe in Jesus. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Now we would never do things that way.
Oh,
now
I'm sure
we say this
somewhere.
is probably now this is we'd say what an awful thing
in America maybe.
And in some objective sense that's true. We understand that now. However, if you understand where these people are standing in their own time, the story gets a little more complicated.
Sure. I'll give you another example in the world of theology that I live in, right? You can do a case study on all the early church fathers about their views on women in the life of the church, right? You pull out a scripture verse that says women ought to be quiet in the sanctuary, right? And then it's like, whoa, in today's day and age, that's very controversial because obviously we respect women's rights and everything else, which is good.
I'd extend it to a lot more people, but
right, exactly, right. But then you can, and people sometimes they're like, oh, look at the Catholics and this and that, and then it's like, yeah, but look at what Martin Luther said too. It's like his views on women were very interesting,
Henry VIII.
You have to take these utterances in the context of their day and age.
At least that's the place to start. If you want to go and make judgments down the road, fine. But at least start with the proper context.
Trying to understand it in the reality that they themselves lived in. It's the same thing that we do with biblical exegesis, right? You need to study the Bible from a first century Jewish perspective if you think that you're going to crack the deeper codes of what's really going on.
Even in the Middle Ages, right? 4 senses, right?
Right. So that is, literal, allegorical, tropological, and anagogical. Very important.
And you remember all 4 of them. I always forget one.
They're extremely important. It's like, it's how you see it with the cruciform lens, right? You know, the literal is, of course, what's going on historically and literally.
Yep.
And then the allegorical is the, how does this connect to Christ? And tropological or moral is all about, you know, how does it connect to the morality of everything? And then anagogical is focused on the eschaton or the last things. And to be able to, it's really enriching to immerse yourself in the living Word of God and to be able to have such a 3D outlook on that. And it speaks to everything that you're saying as a historian. You know, it's a bit of a different art when you're taking on, you know, something that's beyond the scope of the living Word of God, but it all interrelates because you have the notes of the Creator and everything in the human experience. So next question. I think, you know, anybody that might want to be interested in this book wants to know, like, how is it that you got involved with this work out of any work that you could take on as a historian?
The story I usually like to tell about it is one Lent I decided to go down to St. Anthony's to do some penance by volunteering around the place.
Yes, it's actually in here.
And I've never stopped suffering ever since. But the pastor there at the time had been doing a lot of research.
Father Secundo.
Father Secundo. I had been doing a lot of research on the local Italian community. He never really had time to assemble it all. And, you know, because of volunteering there, which ended up being over quite a few years, you know, I learned he had all of this material, and finally said, you know, maybe you're a historian, maybe you should think about, you know, putting this together. And so, you know, a lot of the initial work was already done, which was you know, as it is, it took, you know, 5-6 years to put this thing together, but you know, at least a lot of it had been assembled, so I knew where to look. And of course, you know, anyone who's done historical research, especially on this kind of history, you know, a lot of it is you know, hanging out in the dust because it's not all nicely cataloged in a library, because nobody's ever done this kind of work before. And so, you know, it's digging through all of this stuff, and the first thing you have to do is organize what's there. And then what am I going to do with it?
Right.
And he already started that process.
And if I may, how do you do that? Because you've mentioned a few times in the interview now that taking on the history of a parish is a unique kind of work. What is it about this that is what do you need to do to put this together, and why is it so rare?
Because a lot of times parishes don't keep careful records, aside from the sacramental records. Obviously, that's important.
I thought the Catholic Church was the best record keeper in history.
Yeah, we want to talk relativism relative to what? You know, once upon a time, yes, but other parts of the world have bypassed them.
Fair enough.
Certainly at this local level. And
it's kind of like the corporations that got more powerful than the governments in all these Marvel movies.
Yeah,
you know?
or there's a sense that, look, this belongs in the archive. Boom. Is it cataloged? No. Do you know where it is? Well, I think it's in that corner over there. Which sometimes can be a good thing, because if you don't know what's there, you also aren't going to throw it out unless you just decide to dynamite the whole place. You know,
Sure.
And that's actually how a lot of the ancient monasteries kept a lot of stuff. I don't know why it's important, but it's been around a long time. You know, throw it in the corner. Good, they did. And so this. Functioned quite a bit like that, and kind of piecing this story together. The diocese had a good archive at one time, and still it's kind of the bigger stuff. Anniversary books typically, you know, would land in the diocesan archive. Sure. You know, sometimes other kinds of correspondence.
And you mentioned how you're indebted to them in the acknowledgments.
Yeah.
How does one go about getting involved with the diocesan archives? You just call the chancery and go
at
over
this
there,
point,
or?
I don't know what's left of it.
Wow.
A lot has changed since that time. You know, among other things, the big scandal, which I think would make that material a lot more off limits
than
it once was.
Fort Knox.
And of course, certain understandings when you go there. Look, it's kind of like the Garden of Eden. Feel free to look in these files, but don't get near that file cabinet. And it's like, yeah, okay, fine. And now I don't think they would, let someone go in there and just on your honor, stay, only pick apples from the trees you're supposed to.
Right.
And it's like I told him, I said, I have no need to go into those files, so why would I even be there? And of course I didn't. But then at some point they decided that maybe they should farm all of these files they have out to the local parishes, and then from there everything gets a little more discombobulated, because how many parishes have an archivist?
So you're not only a journalist, you're an investigative journalist.
I never thought of it that way, but in any case, and the other side of this story, of course, is this is a parish that was run through all of its existence until very recently by the Scalabrinians.
Right.
So they have their own records, and through Father Secondo, he had collected a lot of those records from their central archives, which, to my understanding, is also has been kind of dormant now too.
Sure.
So it was just kind of the sweet spot to kind of get all of this stuff together. And
what an adventure!
Yeah, and then you gotta kind of dig through the hearsay stuff. There are stories even in anniversary books. Parishioners tell stories. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not.
Sure.
It's like with our cathedral here, the King Ludwig windows, and not all of the facts are accurate, but
I always say there's three sides to every story, right? Yours, mine, and the truth, or yours, mine, and God's.
At least three, yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes there's more.
Of course.
Yeah, and so
that's in the simplest of moral and analysis.
So things
right?
just kind of lined up right for this, and I was kind of looking for a project at the time, and being a European historian who didn't have a lot of money, I spent a lot of time doing part-time work, which isn't good for world travel. I kind of took on local history. Which is something that's easily accessible. I just have to drive somewhere to do it. And
right.
And since I'm a Europeanist, obviously I was very fascinated with the European heritage of many of the Catholic parishes in Buffalo, and started with a history of all of Buffalo's Catholic churches at a time when I thought a lot of them are struggling, and this would be good to create some public awareness. Book did not sell well, so mission unaccomplished.
You mean you didn't get rich and go live in Europe for the rest of your life?
Yeah, well, I was just hoping to make a little noise so people recognize these places, because a lot of people who left these neighborhoods, they left and never looked back, and to a certain extent I understand that. They've moved out of poverty and all of that, but they've also oftentimes given up a lot of their cultural heritage, so you get this really disfigured culture. You have Italians, for example, who are mainly about spaghetti and meatballs, and but the richness of their heritage somehow gets lost. Germans, who end up mainly about beer and Oktoberfest, and not all Germans drink beer. Hate to break that to them, but and
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, and so. There are bigger stories here. People come from different regions of these places. I mean,
well, what about Irish? I've heard there's Irish, and then there's Catholic, and then there's Irish Catholic, right? Is the old adage?
I suppose. I'm sure. And there's nothing necessarily illegitimate about what these ethnic groups have become here, but they do need to acknowledge that they're different. They came from wherever they came from at a certain point in time, and wherever they came from has moved on, and they moved on in a different way here in America. So there's a world of difference.
It's kind of like how in the Polish community, Dingus Day has become such an anomaly here in America, even way more so than in Poland.
Well, the whole polka culture. When a lot of the Poles were coming over here, everyone in Europe was all enthralled with polkas. This is the age of Johann Strauss, and everybody's doing polkas, which actually, by the way, didn't come from Poland at all. It came from the Czechs. And that kind of got frozen in place with the Polish Americans. And then you have more recent Poles who come over, and they're just shaking their heads as, what is this? It's not something they've had any experience with. And that's okay, because maybe they can learn older folk ways from these Polish Americans, because their clock stopped in Poland when they came over here. And when a lot of them came, there wasn't even a Poland. That's already a story. And I've heard of German philologists who come here to study the Amish, because they speak a German that nobody has spoken in Central Europe since 17-something.
Wow.
So we can learn a lot from each other, and oftentimes it becomes this kind of one-upmanship. It's like, well, I'm a recent immigrant and you guys are idiots, or you get the Polish American, the German American, and they look at the more recent immigrants and say, well, they're just so un-American, and it's not a better or worse scenario. It's just different.
Absolutely. These are observations, and one has the power and the choice to perceive a reality without judging the reality. And there's a lot to learn. I mean, we're kind of narrowing our scope on just these four main cultures that comprise Catholic Buffalo, but that's true throughout the entire American experience. I've heard many, say, you've got African Americans and then you've got Africans. And the cultures can be radically different in that regard.
Oh, yeah.
And then you have to ask what part of Africa are we talking about? I mean, there's hundreds of tribes within just one country sometimes.
Africa as a continent. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's like, we equate Africa as a country. It's a huge continent. And
yes.
Yeah, and these kinds of attitudes. Well, they're all black, then they're going to get along. No,
it's insulting.
Same
thing with being called white. I actually don't really identify that way. I identify as European. I don't know how you feel about that. Hot take as a Europeanist.
Well, for starters, usually even if white people are white, they're sick.
Fair enough.
Truth be told.
Indeed.
Yeah, we're European. It's like
Caucasian.
Again,
I don't know.
The way I explain this in class, the bigger these groups of people are identified as, the more artificial it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Family is real. Tribe is real. Clan is real. When you start extending that, and if you know anything about in Europe, I mean, there's this attitude that, white people don't have tribes, only people of color have tribes. You don't understand Europe at all if you think that. There are real
some
tribes
say
there
it's by
too.
design in the American experiment to pull different groups apart from having a sense of community.
It might be. I had a colleague years ago who said, how come in Africa they call it tribal warfare, and in Europe they call it ethnic violence? Excellent point, right? And but if you go then to nationality, what exactly is a nationality? It's nation states make sense for big armies, big economies. And they have their usefulness, no question. And then if you go beyond that, you end up with a race. Race has come to mean a lot because we've made a lot of it.
Yeah, I love the solemnity with which you said that.
But if you travel from Norway to Central Africa, where exactly is this race line?
It's a great question.
You're
the expert.
And that... What do they call this in philosophy? The reduction to absurdity.
Well, yeah.
And obviously, we place great stake in this, and it takes on a life of its own. And we know it's an awful history. It's a tortured history, and it has all kinds of outworkings that we're still trying to work our ways through.
Sure.
Aren't we all basically human when all is said and done?
Well, again, it's like, why is it a competition of suffering? That's something that drives me crazy too. It's like,
well, that's politics, right?
Well, that's a good point. And one thing that I found myself, when I developed this podcast, it was the subtagline is where eternal beatitude begins in this life, because I want to bring, some different gifts, including spiritual theology, into the mix. And what we're aiming to do here is, we're seeking what it takes for a healthy and thriving culture. So this is such an apropos conversation that we're having right now. Like when I look at, black or white in the context of race, it's like, as a trained philosopher, it's very boring to me because you're talking about mere accidents.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like accidents are not that interesting. It's like, put some more substance to it, but then you have to transcend that.
And that shows you what discrimination really can do. You're holding this against me. I can't control this.
Right. Well, absolutely.
I was born
it's
this way.
very ignorant.
Yeah.
And so it's like, right off the bat there, it's like, if you want to talk about how to have a healthy culture, you got to transcend this nonsense. How do you do that? Right. Critical thinking. So by arming yourself with the knowledge, that's why it was one of the greatest honors of my life to be able to teach philosophy at a high school level, because I personally believe that's about the age at which, a young forming mind can start to really take on abstractive thinking to the point where you can...
In a very unfiltered way, usually.
Well,
Yeah, which can be a good thing.
and because you do, and what is philosophy, right? It is the highest end by which man can ascertain the light of natural reason by his own ability. It's like, and that requires stretching.
So how's that work? Yeah.
That requires abstraction, and then concretizing it though in the objective.
As
right?
St. Bernard might say. So how's that working?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, but the more that we can arm the populace, if I may, does that sound like revolutionary speech? Like, this is what the great philosophers of old, even the pagan, like I think it was St. Justin Martyr that said that Socrates is a saint. Like he armed people with the knowledge about how to think critically, and then he lived what he believed.
He did okay for a stonemason.
He didn't do too bad, huh?
Yeah. And that helped to keep him focused on reality, I think.
Right.
Think about it.
Right. Well, trades aren't all that bad. Right?
Yeah. You walk into a brick wall, you can't deny it exists.
Indeed.
It's a good place to start.
Indeed. And then you get, of course, a goofball like Descartes come along many centuries later. And, he's a bit of a coward. He kind of like couched his belief system in these abstract thinkings in order to like pilot it, because he knew that
Well, I get what he's saying. It's like, let's strip out all of this noise and try to start from scratch. And I know that I think. But, yeah. And you're going to do this all by yourself, buddy?
Sure. For one. And for two, it's like, the truth, like, this is one of the things that's so brilliant about the gospel message. It's simple, just like God. Mm-hmm. And when you're in the light,
and yet confuses the daylights out of us.
Well, I mean, it is a very powerful supernatural light, but it's like, it's just that it's the light is meant to be out in the open. We don't hide our talents in the bushels. And it's like, if it's truly of the light, you don't have to play a Descartes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just...
Well, most of us aren't even capable of that. I mean, I even look at these people I disagree with. It's like, how did they even come up with this stuff? They must have been a lot smarter than I am. It's like, gee.
Yeah, no kidding, right? But in any event, so let's bring it back to this book specifically. So we've got a really, really good broad picture about, the art of being a historian, how to do it well without getting caught up in this whole, like, history is written by the victors. Like, I guess I should get a hot take from you on that as well.
Well, it's often true.
Of course.
And a lot of that, again, has to do with sources. Which sources survive?
Right.
Most of what we know about the past has been determined by librarians and janitors. They decide what stays and what goes.
Yes.
If there's any reason for humility as a historian, that's it.
Absolutely.
We're big important people and we have all kinds of letters after our names, but we can only work with what we've been presented with, which is why interpretation is so important. You got to throw a rope across a lot of gaps, because you can't relive any past experience 100%, because you don't have time. Because 100% reliving the experience means you've lived the whole thing, and we can't possibly do that. And even if we did, we're only in a certain piece of it.
That was deep.
Pearl Harbor, right? What did you see at Pearl Harbor? I don't know. I was face down in a ditch trying to stay alive. So even those guys there, how much did they know about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Not much.
They found that out afterwards.
That's by design as well, right?
They found out afterwards because someone had to say, "Well, do you know what happened here?" Right?
Yeah.
That starts with news, of course, and when you get a little more distance from it, you start to figure out the so what's a bit better.
How does the interpretive lens of the news do when it comes to bringing history to bear?
Sometimes okay, sometimes not so okay. And maybe it's because they lack the historical consciousness of it.
Okay.
And I think sometimes, or it's like, go out there and get that story. They don't have time to study it. Or you have, freshly minted journalists out of journalism school, and they don't have the background. I see that sometimes even with local news around here. It's like, there's so much they're missing. And I don't know if it's entirely right to criticize them.
Well, it's part of the human condition.
Some of them are trying to do an honest job. And I say that acknowledging full well a lot of them come with really strong ideological orientations too, at some levels.
Some of that's been...
It's often more in the editing.
The education today.
It's more in the editing than oftentimes that, they're out there saying, that's shameless if they do that. But you can see what makes the cut to actually make the report. sometimes that's where the real bias happens.
I think that's why so many people are flocking to podcasting platforms, because you have the opportunity for a long form discussion and to be represented in context.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing in a lot of ways.
Or what was that thing before Thanksgiving, that tragic car crash up in Niagara Falls?
Oh, I don't. Sure.
And you have one news outlet that's saying, well, some unfortunate thing happened. But, it was probably
it's a terrorist attack.
And then you have the others that are screaming that this is an imminent terrorist attack. There's more to come. And then you get the other news outlet that simply says, well, a car crashed into the barrier and exploded, burst into flames. That's all we know.
Yeah.
Which of these was probably the most on point with that at that moment? Obviously later on we learn a little more about it, but
I happened to be dining with someone within 24 to 48 hours that was close friends with the family that was in that vehicle. Yeah. So every once in a while you find yourself, wow, this is the news. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it is truly humbling how that whole journey can go. I've had conversations with some local, very young reporters, mentioning the tremendous accolades that somebody has earned in their craft, maybe even in their own studio. And the immediate reaction is envy. And it's like, wait a minute. You got to get your morality right. Like, this is a selfless craft. And this is something that, when you're in service of the truth is a representation of God himself.
But I have a car payment due.
Well,
there's that kind of stuff going on.
No,
too.
There's no question. And that's why.
Or the deadline. Try being accurate with a deadline. I don't know how many times I've written things, and then I go back to it later and say, how did I write that? But I had the time to fix it. And which is also a very humbling experience, and I know you'll see things like that in the book too. It's everything I've ever written and published. Somehow it always magically falls open to a page where there's this big honking typo or something, and it's like, okay, the ego trip lasted 15 seconds. Okay, back to reality.
Good.
Yeah, actually, yes, good.
Yes. Well, so we got the hot take on history written by the victors, and now we've got this actual book that. So one thing I want to hone in on, something that for the viewers and listeners that may not know something about me is that I have a deep connection to this parish as well. So this is kind of living history in a lot of ways, which is fascinating because you go from 1890, it's founded in 1891, and then you go into the era of, through the world wars, this parish, changed hands a lot. The Scalabrinian Fathers were kind of the core of developing this community. And there's all kinds of politics. I find myself throughout the life of this channel, I've come to realize it's such an important PSA to always repeat that, politics is downstream from culture, but even culture has to be downstream from immutable morality. Because that's what we learn when you again follow the philosopher's quest, and then of course it leads you to the unmatchable treasure of theology that morality is immutable, right? So, but then you get down to the politicking level, and
how do you apply it? Yes,
exactly, right, into the reality, the raw dollars and cents of it, and whatever, having to stay in the black, whatever the issue might be. Yeah. And then there's all this tumult and all of these changes throughout the life of St. Anthony's. This is just like one case study, and it's fascinating. And then you get through the world wars. In World War II in particular, of course, Italy is on the wrong side of history, as you write in here, with the promulgation of fascism. And, that ends up connecting into the lifeblood of the ethos of a given community. And parish life is no different, right? And so it's such an interesting journey with its highs and lows. And then you get to the weird part, right? There's like the present, and it's like history is still being written. And so, this book goes till 2011. I had my adult conversion into the faith in the mid-2010s and came into the life of St. Anthony's. And I have to say, I have to ask you this question. Well, let me finish contextualizing and then I'll ask. So, I'm really, really partial to the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass has formed my family in a tremendously beautiful way. And, I just found it so strange in my mid-20s that I didn't even know it existed ever. talk about like a whitewashing history. And then I had to ask the question, why? It's like, how did I not even know this ever existed, let alone it existed from the 500s circa with St. Gregory the Great?
You were born too late. Some of us, we still remember it for real.
With all the good, the bad, and the ugly, I bet. Yep. I'm sensing it in your voice. But then it's, then 1969, it's gone with the Novus Ordo Missae, which, by the way, Novus Ordo, there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking around that. You can look at the dollar bill or whatever. It's like, even when St. Pius V promulgated, he codified the Tridentine Mass back in the late 1500s, the books in Latin back then said Novus Ordo on them because it was the new order.
Well, that's a relative term too, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. And I think, acknowledging...
New relative to what? Right?
Well, acknowledging working definitions for what they are helps to kind of alleviate some of the conspiratorial nonsense that can converge around these this telling of a real life history. And so, we came into the Latin Mass. I got involved in the life of St. Anthony's early 2015, and volunteered a lot like how you did. And I was asked to do different leadership roles with the choir and was on the parish council for years. So I learned...
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, me too. Well...
You want to talk politics, talk parish councils.
We're not going to do that. That's not really what this podcast is about. And in fact, I've made it very clear throughout the life of my podcast that politics is actually not that interesting to me. Like, I genuinely, like, I don't know. It's just, especially in the secular realm. This idea that there's two sides and you're one or the other is... Talk about a lack of nuance.
But if you want the platform for ecumenical dialogue, anyone from any religious tradition will tell you the politics is the same.
Okay.
Whether you go to a Methodist church or an Episcopalian church or a synagogue, there's always politics around the religion.
Would you? Well,
it's kind of interesting.
That's an interesting point. And let me ask you this then: would there be? Because ecumenism is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's important, and I've been given a really, really important role by the bishops. There's three that are involved because of the succession to be a part of the new evangelization. Specifically, we focus on existing Catholics and try to help them to rediscover like what that actually means. And it's come with some really profound challenges. I mean, basically, you talk about God qualifies the called but doesn't call the qualified. I mean, when I was thrust into that in my young 20s, it was kind of like I had to realize, wow, okay, the Second Vatican Council happened some decades ago, and there's a whole lot of tension around that. Revolving what it means to be a Catholic today. And I need to understand this in order to do what the bishops expect of me, which was kind of a lot, but I was humbled to be able to take on that role.
And how do we define lay participation?
Right, because that has so much to do with the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah, so many people don't seem to get that right one way or another.
Well, and so let me finish contextualizing and then kick it back to you. So the Latin Mass has become part and parcel of the life of this parish because they came, I had an elder actually come up to me on Holy Thursday this past year out of nowhere and kind of answer a prayer that had been on my heart that week, which was really wild. I was wondering, I introduced Gregorian chant back into the life of the parish and by extension, from what I understand, possibly the life of the diocese since maybe 1969, which is, a tremendous honor. It's something for my family's legacy and my kids to know that, I mean, Gregorian chant, objectively speaking, is one of the hardest forms of singing there is. And to put in all of that, the time and effort to be able to gift that to the community was a big deal. But I didn't know whether or not it truly went back to the beginning of the Latin Mass community in our area. This gentleman came out of nowhere, literally, and said to me, "Oh, your children need to be in the choir." And I'm like, "Oh, hey, sir," and this and that. He's in his 70s or his 80s. And I didn't even know his name. I'd seen him for years, but I, asked him about that, the context of it. I'm like, by the way, do you have any idea that, how I was involved with bringing Gregorian chant? He's like, I was there for everything. It was amazing. And he said, I said, was there ever Gregorian chant at St. Anthony's before that? And he said, St. Anthony's came, the Latin Mass came to St. Anthony's circa 1990, and there had never been anything like that. Up until 2018 Holy Week when we did that. And, he said, it was always the simple sung propers, also known as the Rossini propers. up until that point. And, he was starting to give me the whole history of kind of the Latin Mass community. And it was just truly humbling to recognize how much goes into it. So that leads to me kicking it back to you now. Since this book only goes till 2011, it started in 1990, though, the Latin Mass's involvement in the life of this Italian community. Is there a connection to that in this book? The Latin Mass being involved or a part of the culture?
I like to think of it as, well, you have the Italian Mass, the new Mass, which is modern Latin. Think about it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And I think the Scalabrinian charism had something to do with it. That it's an order that was constituted to work with immigrants, to work with people who somehow have lost their roots, and so there always was that kind of charism there about kind of an open door. You invite people in, and so everybody is welcome, and it wasn't this kind of oh, you're all welcome, and it wasn't that kind of welcome. It's just like
come as you are, but discover your roots.
Like my wife often says, you want to be welcoming, unlock the door. And, at that time, St. Anthony's was very much a downtown parish. There was an early morning mass. There was a noon mass. And, the people from City Hall used to come because it was the closest church for City Hall. And the door was unlocked all day, every day. Wow. And so there was this kind of sense. And eventually some of the regulars who came to weekday masses used to stay for lunch. Father Secondo used to cook lunch, or someone there used to cook lunch. And then they'd have some lunch, and then they'd go back to their offices. And so there was this kind of, kind of an easygoing atmosphere that, look, in some ways, very much lusciously Italian. Wow. People come through the door, you feed them. And a lot of events to keep them involved, because, it's a parish that lost its neighborhood. With the urban renewal, basically the neighborhood went. So you have to do things to keep people reminded that this church is there and it's open. And so the community got very good at that. And so prior to the Latin Mass being at St. Anthony's, they did a short stint at
St. Joseph's Cathedral, right?
Yeah, and before that they were at Blessed Trinity briefly. And then they went to St. Joseph's Cathedral, which, as I understand, was always kind of a strange relationship. Strained in part, I think, because the cathedral got very much Vatican II'd in a lot of bad ways.
Like the spirit of Vatican II kind of a thing.
Well, and the old Latin altars were gone, and I know that bothered a lot of the Latin Mass people. That because at that time, especially, the bishop's chair was right in the center.
Okay.
And there was like a wooden altar in front of it, and the complaint was it looks like a Masonic hall. And
there is a lot of theological weight behind the importance of altar rails, because that is the laity's personal sacrifice that they're making when they go to the altar. So absolutely.
Well, liturgy should reflect your theology, right?
Right.
And it can do that in a number of ways.
There's no question.
It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing.
Well, that's
so St. Anthony's was more of a natural fit. It was a smaller church at that time. The
Yes.
community wasn't that big, and this was a way to bring more people into St. Anthony's Church.
And by the way, you mentioned Blessed Trinity. Is that the one with like thousands and thousands of pieces of artwork, Romanesque,
Yep.
from
Over on Leroy.
1100s or so style of?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, the basic objective there was to incorporate every possible Christian symbol somewhere there, and every time you go there,
Talk about a gem.
Yeah.
Probably, in my humble opinion, one of the top 3 parishes in terms of beauty that we have around here.
And Buffalo had a lot of them. We've lost a lot of them now, but
yes,
that's a topic I don't want to get started on because
no, I understand. There's certain other religions that get involved, and it's like consecration is consecration. We deeply revere a consecrated space, and we like it to remain that way. But in any event, so I'm sensing from you, Marty, that it's so strange living the life of a historian, and because I almost think that some of the greatest stories that could ever be told are the stories obviously rife with controversy, also stories that make an impact. You mentioned when this book first came out, you'd hope that it would raise awareness. It almost sounds like you're tapping into the rich historical heritage of what St. Anthony's has to offer in terms of, we need to maintain our relevancy in a certain sense. And part of it, again, goes back to survival, but another part of it is just to actually live the Great Commission of the gospel. But when you do that, sometimes it's almost like you get a bigger target on your back as well. So I guess the question then is, how does an historian, a true expert in your craft as you are, how do you toe that line between telling the greatest story, local story that you possibly could, while also, I guess, maintaining, safety or security or however intensely you want to get it. But because, you talk in an Italian community, of course, there's mafioso notes that have been throughout historically. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that the Irish and the Italians had a lot to do with, the mafias had a lot to do with how the current court system is exercised in America.
Yeah, I can't say I know a lot about that, but every ethnic group has stuff they'd rather not talk about. And I think that's true of everybody.
Of course.
And again, the trick is to talk about it in a sensitive way. And the mafia is a reality. Most Italians aren't part of it. Most Sicilians aren't part of it. But you can acknowledge the existence. As a historian, I look at the stuff. It is what it is. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to be ashamed of it. It's in the past, and just deal with it and move on. And I know a lot of people struggle with that with family history too. When they find out their grandma was, they're people. They had lives. They did things. They made bad choices. They made good choices. That's part of what being human is, and part of telling these stories as well is to tell people, look, you have a rich heritage behind you. Don't throw it away.
Amen.
Understand that it's there, from the Catholic side, from the ethnic side, this and how you express your Catholicity. Different ethnicities express it in different ways. All good, legitimate stuff. Let's go back to Gregory the Great on that one. And so often we impoverish ourselves voluntarily. We go out to, Our Lady of the Concrete Block somewhere out in the suburbs, and, there's this kind of, and I know there's good and devout people out in the suburbs, but, the way someone put it to me once is like, why go to the picnic when you can go to the banquet? And these old churches, they gave it their all. And when you consider that these are poor people who did this.
Yes.
And then somehow when we get prosperous, we can't do it anymore.
Why?
Good question. Okay, this is when you'll probably get in real trouble. Less distractions, maybe. You didn't have the Church of the Buffalo Bills. And don't get me wrong. I think football is great. I think.
Oh, sure. We're killing it right now. And Josh, keep doing you, man. He took my number, actually, from sports growing up.
And there you go. But
I'm glad he wears it well.
But, again, getting things to balance properly is important. And I think a lot of us, we struggle with it because, there's just so much pulling at us now. And, when, in a sense, being stuck in a ghetto, in an ethnic neighborhood, yes, it has its downsides, but on the other hand, you really know who you are. And how do you get the best of both of those worlds where you're free to move about however you can, and nobody, kind of looks at you and like, what are you doing here? How do you do that at the same time and stay true to who you are and cherish that heritage? And I think that's a tough balancing act for a lot of people. And we don't always get it right. I know I don't always get it right either.
But both.
You understand the importance of this stuff at least, and convey it to your children. And I know the diocese right now is having these discussions too. How do you engage the younger generations? You have the grandparents and the parents that go to church, and the kids are nowhere to be seen.
And thank God.
Something has happened there, right? They're not being told about this stuff. And I'm not sure it's just about Catholic schools, because at a certain point they became part of the problem too. But talk about this stuff, show that you're serious about it, and I guess maybe the most important thing a lot of parents and grandparents can do is show that they mean business. And I don't know,
Wow.
I don't know if there's a magic formula for that, but show that you mean business.
Well, what I'm hearing you saying, please excuse me for interrupting, because this is sage wisdom here, is, you need to be honest. And you need to have the freedom to be honest with all that comes with that. And thank God is what I was going to say. You mentioned, the importance of trying to pass this on to the next generation, and how do we get the youth involved? The diocese is figuring that out all the time in real time. And I'm so thankful for my role in this, right? Because I've been tasked with doing this, what we're doing right now. And, I taught my students in philosophy, some of the greatest advisors that you could ever have when it comes to trying to crack the code on these important, sensitive at times, and just really complex issues, nuanced, is, the greatest advisors you're ever going to get are the ones that tell you what you don't want to hear, but it's still the truth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there needs to be an allowance within the culture to be able to wrestle with the good, the bad, and the ugly, and get what we all want at the end of the day out of it.
You don't have to express it angrily. Just, this is how it is.
Even if there is some anger. St. Thomas Aquinas says...
Well, some people respond to that strangely. I mean, I never did. I kind of came from a kick-butt family, but, some...
No, I get it. Well, listen, I'm also got some choleric in my temperament, and so, like a St. Paul or a Boagernes, you know what I mean? So it is what it is. People respond to things differently in different ways, and I realize a lot of my generation hasn't been trained up that way. But
do you need a psychiatrist, or do you need a kick in the, and it's always a prudential judgment. Which is it that'll take?
Yeah, it could be both.
Maybe a little of both. How hard is the kick? That's where it's important to understand something about human nature, and I guess maybe that's something historians can bring to that discussion. We have to know a little bit about psychology. Street psychology. Obviously, we don't learn it out of a book.
Yes.
I think most historians are kind of wannabe philosophers, and I've had a number of philosophers tell me that they're wannabe historians, so it's kind of a natural.
Interesting.
Well, we're all dealing with, human activities and their meanings, right? And, obviously at some point you got to confront right and wrong. And no matter how jaded anyone might be, there's still that sense of right and wrong out there, even if it's maybe a twisted sense.
Right. Well, and you mentioned way earlier that, people don't get up out of bed and then, try to go be evil necessarily. Usually, it's St. Thomas Aquinas says it so well. He says, we will under the aspect of the good, right? So that's kind of, and we're designed as God's creation, right? The intellect is your king, the will is your queen, and everything else needs to be its subject. And when we will under the aspect of the good, the way this is supposed to work is that you choose between goods. Yeah. That's true freedom.
Yeah.
That's free will exercised appropriately. Unfortunately, with the fall of mankind and when sin entered the picture, we get really perverted and distorted and confused about that. And you think it's freedom means I can choose between good or evil, or I can choose between evils. But we always, you're hijacking the nature of how we were created when you go down that road. Because, you need to justify in your mind why what you did, which was evil, is somehow good, or you think you're going to get something good out of it in order to do that. It's a better idea to truly transcend all of that nonsense and to fulfill that quest that we're all on, the historian philosopher quest.
Yeah. So how's all that working out?
Well, hey, is that the jadedness coming out?
So,
wow. Well, we covered some incredible ground here, Marty. I want to kick it back to you. I mean, can you think of any famous last words to throw into the mix? Because I really love the way that you just brought out some really profound wisdom to contextualize why all of this is so important, even when you bring history into the present.
Well, final last words. Oh, gosh.
Or unless you got plenty of time. I got plenty more time as well.
Have a nice day. Be good, or it's going to get a lot hotter. That works better when it's not winter. But
well, some say hell is actually frozen, and there's just parts of hell that are hot. How do you think about that?
Well, that's how Dante portrays it, right? The ultimate depths of hell is frozen. So does that mean, I shouldn't say this, does this mean when we die we go to Buffalo?
Well, they also say that hell will freeze over when the Bills win the Super Bowl, right?
Or
what if this year's our year?
Or is it just knowing you're never getting out of it? It might be just like here, but you know you're never getting out of it.
Talk about generational curses.
There you go. Right. No end. We tend to think of that as being a good thing, right? But think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
As we come to an end.
Amen, brother. Well, Marty, it's been truly, truly a privilege to meet you over the years, and I thank you so much for gifting this book to me when you did. I think that really speaks to your character and your heart. We're all, when we're involved in church community, it's just that. A lot of times it's just sheer volunteerism, but it's always, giving of ourselves to try to build up the community and ultimately to lead souls to Christ. And I think it's so important for us to remember that and to keep that into context in terms of crystallizing our mission, our vision, our focus, and why it is that we do what we do. And maybe we'll figure out the how as well, right?
I'll let you know.
So
same time in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, an Italian Immigrant Community and the Scalabrinian Fathers, St. Anthony of Padua Church in Buffalo, New York. I highly recommend getting this work. This in many ways, I've had a lot of church leaders, reach out to me, some in anticipation of this episode. They're very, very excited. And they've called St. Anthony's the epicenter in the life of our diocese in a lot of ways, especially because you have that, that connection to the Latin now as well, the mother tongue of Italian, French, Spanish, and so many others. And, we are living history. In fact, as this comes out on the vigil of the Epiphany, we are experiencing a new beginning in 2024 in the life of this parish. We have brand new priests that are starting this upcoming Sunday that are coming into, the future of the Latin community and the Italian community. So history on goes and God's will be done. And thank you again for your gift and talents.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you enjoy content like this, I exhort you to please like the video, subscribe. I'm sure many who are tuning in at this point have already subscribed. I really just ask you, share it, spread this content, because we really have the ability to be a part of holiness, the solution, and really just revitalizing our region. And that's something that we're all looking to do here in the Western New York region. And of course, you can check out all the other episodes of The Rich Dawn here. God bless you.